Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening to the Chalberg Theater here on behalf of the rest of the board of the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government. I'd like to give you a sincere welcome to a great evening we have lined up for you this evening. I'm Greg Blaine. I am the president of the board of the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government. Our organization's mission is to help educate the public on issues and topics that are concerning to and involve leaders in state and local government, but also the people they represent and the voting public of central Minnesota and all across the state. Our work has led us to a tremendous opportunity to hold this forum this evening, and here to welcome our guest this evening is the executive director of the Rosenmeier Center and a professor of political science here at Central Lakes College, Mr. Steve Wenzel.
Thank you, Greg, for that kind introduction. I'm also going to introduce to you our interviewer tonight for the program, and that's Dr. Tim Hool, who is also the administrator for Crow Wing County. Thank you, Tim, for participating and helping with this great program. I deem it a high honor to introduce to you a person who has been a great public servant and an icon on the Minnesota scene. Justice Alan Page is a graduate of Notre Dame University and played football on Notre Dame's great football team. In 1967, he signed with the Minnesota Vikings and distinguished himself as a great Vikings team member. In 1971, Alan Page was named the National Football League's most valuable player. He also played in 4 Super Bowls. Mr. Page is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. Finally, in 1992, Mr. Page sought election to the Minnesota Supreme Court and won in a landslide. He was the first African American on the court and one of the very few associate justices to join the court initially through election rather than appointment by the governor. Justice Page retired from the Minnesota Supreme Court in 2015. Justice Page and his wife Diane founded the Page Education Foundation in 1988, which assists students of color in their pursuit of post-secondary education. The Page Foundation has already awarded $16 million in grants and scholarships to over 7,000 students. Finally, in 2018, Justice Page was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is our nation's highest civilian award, and whose recipients are selected by the President of the United States. I want to conclude by simply saying that Justice Page's appearance tonight at Central Lakes College is really very, very special. Page's advisory for improving the quality, his advocacy for improving the quality of education for Minnesota's school children ideally fits in with the mission and the purpose of the Gordon Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government, which is there to inform and educate our citizenry on the vital issues of the day. With no further ado, it is my privilege to introduce to you Justice Alan Page. Thank you.
Are our mics on okay? Can you everybody hear me okay? Good, good, good.
And you can hear me okay?
Good. Justice Page, welcome to Brainerd, and we are thrilled to have you here. Your reputation in the education field and your advocacy for education is well known, I think, to those who have followed your career over the course of time. And so we're thrilled to have you here tonight to talk about the Page Amendment, an amendment proposed to the Minnesota Constitution. So let's begin by, tell us a little bit about the Page Amendment and what it is.
Well, let me go back to sort of my involvement in it.
Okay.
And while it's nominally named the Page Amendment, it is really an amendment about children and about ensuring that every child, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, what part of the state they're from, no matter the color of their skin, their ability or disability, their economic status, all of those things aside, every child should have the opportunity to have a public education that allows them to fulfill their highest selves. And about, it's coming up on 4 years ago now, 3.5 years ago, I got a call. I'm sitting at home, sort of goofing off, truth be told. And I get a call from the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. Not something that happens every day. And Neil Kashkari. And Neil invited me to come to lunch. He had something he wanted to talk about. And I was so shocked, I'm not even sure at that point I asked what it precisely was he wanted to talk about. But I was smart enough to say yes. I shouldn't say smart enough, maybe wise enough. But I went down, had lunch with President Kashkari and some of the researchers there at the Federal Reserve Bank. And they had been doing some research which indicated that for children of color, indigenous children, and poor white children, the gaps in educational achievement were staggering. Anywhere from 15 to 30% lower than their more wealthy white counterparts. And President Kashkari was interested in talking about what we might do to change that course, to change the course. And he was specifically interested in how we might use the law to do that. And we looked at the foundation of Minnesota's education law, which is the Minnesota Constitution. I believe it's Article 13. And noted that it provides for an education system. And I had been involved when I first joined the court in an education funding case that in the end the court held that while the Constitution provided for an education system and that children had a fundamental right to an adequate system, it did not hold that they had a right to a quality education. And so we thought, well, if Minnesota were to amend its constitution to make education a fundamental right, a civil right, And then within that amendment, ensure that there were remedies for the failure to vindicate that right, that things might change. And I would note that these gaps in educational achievement and performance, they're not new. They have been around for a long, long time. My interest in education began when, as a young child, my parents constantly reinforced in me and my siblings that education was a tool that we could use to have a better life than what we might otherwise have. And almost, actually before I started playing football, I noted that young men I grew up in Canton, Ohio. Young men in Canton, Ohio, there were an inordinate number of them who had played high school football, been very successful, some who had gone on to play at some of this nation's best post-secondary academic institutions. When their playing days were over, ended up back in Canton unemployed and unemployable because they hadn't gotten a decent education. And that's sort of where it began for me. And mind you, I was pretty young at the time, so I wasn't exactly focused on it. But a funny thing happened once I started playing football, and I didn't start playing football until I was a ninth grader. Almost immediately, indeed almost before I had even been to the first practice, people would come up to me and say, you know, you should talk to young children or go to schools and talk to young children about the importance and value of education. Mind you, I'm one of those young children myself at that point. Over time, I started doing that. I've spent a lot of time in schools and classrooms over the last 50 plus years. And I'm convinced that the single most important thing we can do for really the benefit of our communities is to ensure that education is number one and that all children have the opportunity.
So tell us a little bit more about the amendment and what are the changes that are proposed and how do you see that fitting into that larger equation?
Well, you can hear that though, can't you? Is that better?
Better? Good. So tell us a little bit more about the amendment and the mechanics of it and what you think how it will help to advance the dialogue.
The current constitutional language, as I noted, provides for an adequate education system. It's system focused. We set out to draft language which put children first. And the language we came up with literally does that. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education that fully prepares them with the skills necessary to participate in our economy, our democracy, and our society, as measured against uniform achievement standards set forth by the state. It is a paramount duty It is the state's paramount duty to ensure quality public schools that fulfill this fundamental right. So it begins by putting children first, and all children. And when I say all children, I mean just that, and the language means just that. All children. As I said, irrespective of race, culture, religion, ability or disability, economic status. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education. So as opposed to an adequate system, it would require a quality education.
So help us to understand, how would you define the differences between the adequate system and the quality education for each child?
Well, we're not educating the system. We're educating children. And because the current language is system-focused, all of our energy goes into looking at the system. And it is a system that has systemically and systematically failed poor children and children of color and indigenous children. And so making it child-focused and quality means that the focus will be on children and ensuring that they are given the tools which will allow them to be successful.
And if that, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and how do we know what quality is? The language contains the quality standard. A quality public education which fully prepares them. Full preparation for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. And it's measured against uniform achievement standards. That clause, uniform achievement, as measured against uniform achievement standards, is intended to ensure that the system provides what children need. You know, right now we measure the performance of children to some degree with standardized tests, which, to my shock, aren't really used to help the children that take them. They don't, the teachers don't get the results. I was shocked to find, and surprised to find out that teachers don't get the results of those tests for 5 or 6 months after they're taken. By then, the children have moved on. So what's the point? Other than to stigmatize those who have not performed well on those tests. And so the language would require that the system's performance be measured. And then that last paragraph, or that last sentence, it is a paramount duty of the state. There is nothing else in the Minnesota State Constitution that rises to the level of a paramount duty. Nothing. There may be other things that are as important as education and that the state's responsible for, but nothing is categorically set forth as being of a paramount duty. The state would have no higher duty than to ensure quality public schools. No higher duty. To ensure quality public schools that fulfill that fundamental right. And note that the state would have no higher duty. So the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch would have a role in ensuring that the constitutional standards are met.
And how do you see each of those roles playing out over the course of time, if the amendment passes and becomes part of the Constitution?
Well, in terms of the legislative branch,
And the executive and judicial.
the legislative branch sets the policy and is the first step in the funding process. The executive branch is required to carry out that policy and to use the funding wisely in ways that create the child-centered education. And when either the legislature or the executive branches fail, the judicial branch is there to vindicate the rights of those children whose civil right has been denied.
And so in the mechanics of how that works, how would you, what would the public expect to see that might be different? And I'm thinking in particular, does this focus on the system and the existing constitutional language and the switch to the focus on the individual, it seems like that could open up for innovation. To each kid can learn a little differently. We know that.
It's clear that all of us learn differently. And what we'll have to do, I have this belief that education works best when it's focused on one school at a time, one classroom at a time, one child at a time. We can figure out what individual children need and provide an education that supports that and gives them the opportunity to take advantage of it. We don't do that now. Right now, the system is, and I would note, our current constitutional language has not been substantially changed since 1857. 1857 is a world that none of us here today really know. The world has changed dramatically. Yet our educational system is still grounded in that language. Also, interestingly, 1857, the United States Supreme Court decided Dred Scott. Is it mere happenstance that today children of color fall behind educationally? Maybe yes, maybe no. But in any event, it is time to bring our educational system into the 21st century.
What do you see as key new features in that education system? If you take your vision and to its logical conclusion, what looks different for folks?
Well, you know, let me just be clear. I'm not an educator, and so I'm not here to dictate what that system looks like. But there are educators. I mean, we're here on a college campus. People who know what works best and know that what we're doing now isn't working. One thing that would be different is, and you know, ideally, at the same time we're going through this process to get the amendment passed, we would have we would be designing that new education system. And one of the things that we think the language that we propose does, it empowers parents, it empowers students, it empowers teachers, and by doing that, we think change will happen. The language also empowers local education boards, because when they're not getting enough support, they can go to the state and say, you're not meeting your constitutional obligation.
So how does that create that sort of freedom for parents, or their empowerment, if you will?
Because their children have a right.
And so when they're coming to talk to the local school board,
They're going to be heard in a way that they're not heard today.
and so how do you see the Page Amendment contributing to closing those achievement gaps?
When you design a system that educates the individual child, I think by its nature, each child now has a reason to rise, to grasp one of that system, because you're teaching me in a way that I can learn, as opposed to the industrial model, which says, you know, we pour all these kids into the pot, some will sink, some will swim, some will do well, some will do poorly, and whoever does, that's just fine. That will change.
You're looking for a better return on that investment.
You're right about that. What was it I saw? The legislative auditor did a report this past spring that showed that, and I think it was pre-pandemic, I could be wrong, that the numbers from the Federal Reserve study showed, and I don't have the numbers here in front of me, so I'm ballparking here. Roughly 70% of children were performing at grade level. The legislative auditor's report showed that children across Minnesota were performing at about something less than 50%. And students of color and poor children were 20 points below that. Now think about that. Roughly half, it was a little less than half, of our students are performing in a way that they met the standards for performance at grade level. If you think about that, and we spend, what is it, at 50, again, I'm ballparking here because I don't remember the numbers, 48 to 50% of the state's budget on education for that kind of performance. That's just, that stuns me that we're willing to put up with that.
We should expect more.
We should expect a lot more, not just more, but a lot more.
So what do you see as the greatest contributors to these achievement gaps today that might be part of what we need to tackle moving forward?
I think the greatest contributor is we educate children like we're building widgets. Stamp them out.
A bit of an assembly line.
Assembly line. Some do well, some don't. That's fine.
It's almost as if we consider it a product defect.
An acceptable product defect.
Mhm.
And I think we can do better than that.
What resources do you see that would be immediately made available to students if the amendment were to pass? What would a student see as maybe how this would roll out from their perspective?
Well, again, I'm not an educator, but I would think they would see, you know, and let me be very, very clear. We like to point fingers at educators and say that they're failing. This is not a teacher problem. It's a system problem. And we can't continue to use the same system and expect to get something different. And so what children are going to see is an education being provided that fits their particular needs.
It's almost like an individual, what do they call it, IEPs?
You know,
For everyone.
bringing up, well, exactly. Bringing up IEPs, at a meeting with a group of superintendents early on in this process, we were having a discussion about trying to enlist their support. And one of the things they were pushing back on, well, this is just going to cost more money. Look what happened to us when we were required to do IEPs for children. You know, it started to get more expensive. And I asked the question, well, when children start getting IEPs, did they start performing better? And they said, well, of course. And it was like, okay, so what's the problem here?
Maybe that's a better return on the investment. There is mention of setting a standard for education. What does that entail? What do you think that looks like?
Well, with my proviso that I'm not an educator, there are educators who, and there are measurement tools out there that measure performance, and I would think we could use some of those tools that are available. You know, General Mills, I suspect they measure everything at every step along the way to see how things are performing. Those same tools are available to measure educational performance.
Probably any public function.
Exactly.
How does the Page Amendment extend to students with special needs? How will they fit into that larger puzzle?
Well, I think, again, it's individual education. To the extent that we have special needs kids, and I don't know, there are a lot of kids that seem to have special needs that, you know, for the most part look like just kids. I mean, every kid's going to be a special needs kid because we're going to have a system that educates the individual child.
I have special needs. You have special needs. We all have unique and special needs.
And we all learn in different ways.
What do you say to people who just say, we need to fund education more?
Well, like I say, we spend upwards of 50% of our state budget now for the product that we're getting. Maybe we could start by spending that 52% differently and get different results.
We keep doing that.
And if more money is needed, we'll have to deal with that. But right now, all the problems we have, and money's an issue, but it's not the only issue. And we could, I believe, more appropriately focus on individualized education plans for each child and using the same amount of money that we spend today and make improvements. And you know, like many things, education is not a zero-sum game. If the system helps me, doesn't mean it hurts you. We both can rise
Together.
together.
What drew you into working on this? What brought you to this? You talked about the Federal Reserve Chair.
Well-
You certainly could say no.
Fundamentally, I was 8 years old in 1954 when the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. A time when large portions of this state, or not this state, but this nation, were subject to state-sponsored segregation that resulted in inferior education for African Americans. That court's decision sounded the death knell for segregation in education, although we haven't quite figured that out yet. But it sounded the death knell for segregation across the board. We've all benefited from that by creating educational opportunities that weren't there. That benefit, or that court decision, gave me hope. Even at that young age, it helped me understand that fairness could prevail, that justice could be done. And I still believe that. You know, education is the great equalizer. It allows any of us and all of us. It gives us the power of choice. With an education, we can choose to a much greater degree what the future holds. And it's something that no one can take away from us. And so, given the foundation that my parents gave me, and that experience as a young kid watching those football players, and the time that I've spent in schools and classrooms, I firmly believe that the better educated each of us is, the better off we all are. And that's why back in 1988, Diane and I started the Page Education Foundation to encourage, motivate, and assist young people of color to pursue education beyond high school, and require our grant recipients, we call them Page Scholars, require our paid scholars to work with young children, kindergarten through 8th grade, as tutors, mentors, and role models, specifically in the area of education, so that those young children could see somebody maybe that they knew, somebody that maybe looked like them, was from their neighborhood, somebody they could relate to, using that tool to achieve their goals. It's something. Education is a tool that will allow all of us to achieve our hopes and dreams, whatever they may be.
How many of those scholarships?
Actually, we're well over 8,000 by now.
Changing lives.
Changing lives.
And not just the scholars.
Oh, absolutely. Changing lives for our scholars, yes. But for those young children that they work with, they do roughly 50 hours per academic year tutoring and mentoring those young children. That's really the important thing we do. I mean, the financial assistance is a benefit, but the real impact is their service to children. And I believe strongly in what all of us can do to influence the lives of young people. I mean, I started my week, my first task this week. You asked earlier what I do in retirement. Well, my Monday morning I was at Justice Page Elementary School in Maplewood reading to 2nd and 3rd graders. Tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon I will be at Roosevelt High School talking to high school students. And Friday morning I will end my week at Justice Page Middle School in Minneapolis.
I imagine that 2nd grader, 50, 60 years from now, telling the story of having the namesake of the school come to read a book to us. That I can see that story spreading.
Well,
it's a great story.
You know, we never know what impact we're going to have with other people. You never know how we're going to influence them. And I've had the good fortune to have a lot of good things happen to me. And I believe that along with that good fortune comes an obligation to do what I can to create hope for those coming behind.
Well said.
Hope and opportunity. You know, as a justice on the Supreme Court, there are often young people coming through our juvenile justice system, sometimes through our criminal justice system. Some of those young people were just, lacked a moral compass. The vast majority of them had simply lost hope. And I believe that through the work that I've done with the Page Education Foundation, the work that I do individually, and the work of the Page Amendment is about creating hope and changing the future, making it better and brighter for all of us.
Student-centered approach to it. What are the next steps in the process?
Finding 50 plus 1% of the state legislature to approve putting it on the ballot. That's the challenge we've faced from the beginning. That's the challenge we face today. And it's been a daunting task.
Are you making headway? Some days I'm sure it feels like you are, and maybe other days it feels like maybe not.
Well, we've been at it since late 2019, and we haven't done it yet, so.
Mm-hmm. What would you ask of the good folks who took time to come today? If they are interested in advancing the amendment, what would you ask of them?
I would ask them to contact their legislators, and ask them to support it.
And if there is only one thing that the folks who came tonight remember from your talk tonight, what is it that you would like them to remember?
Each of us has the power to create change. We have the power to educate children, all children. We're not talking about something that's impossible. We're not talking about something that is out of reach, but it's going to take action on all our parts. And I would ask that they be engaged. There's a 501c3 that is supporting our efforts. It's Our Children Minnesota. If you want to know, if you want more information, you can find them online. I guess another thing I would want you to think about, and it sort of goes into, why is the Federal Reserve interested in this? Well, the Federal Reserve is charged with two responsibilities: keeping the economy going and doing what they can to create full employment. And it's that full employment piece. Because every child that gets left behind, this isn't theoretical, this is fact. Every child that gets left behind is a diminished employee, a diminished taxpayer, more likely to become a burden on society, and at the rate we are leaving children behind today, we cannot sustain our economy or our society.
I was thinking the economic needs of our society are not being necessarily as well served when we're leaving folks behind.
Exactly.
Do you have time for questions?
Certainly.
We'll take some questions from the audience. We would like to make sure that the questioners wait, and we'll bring a mic to you. This gentleman right here has a question so that we get it on the recording and that others can hear you.
Judge, have any other states had have similar legislation, and did you consider other types of legislation than constitutional amendment?
Did everybody hear the question? It was, are other states looking at this kind of a thing, and do we have any examples and did you consider other legislation?
Did we consider legislation other than the constitutional amendment? Over the last, I think it's 15 years. I think it's 15, it's possible it's 20. There have been 122 pieces of legislation tackling education problems. 122, and things have gotten worse instead of better. The two things that are important about what we're doing: one, civil right; two, a remedy. We have a right to an adequate system today, not much in the way of remedy. And have other states, there have been other states that have amended their constitutions. I think ours goes maybe a step further than most of those that have. As an example, Florida amended their constitution. Actually, they've amended it 3 times since, I think, 1998, 1999. They made education a fundamental value. We make it a fundamental right. I think that's a little stronger. And I guess Florida is probably the best example. In and they did a whole host of things in their constitution that resulted in legislative action that resulted in change. But at the time they amended their constitution, both Minnesota and Florida were about, of the 50 states, 31st, 32nd, something like that, in terms of educational achievement performance. Or actually, I think it's been a while since I've thought this through or talked about it, so I'm maybe a little bit off here. But it could be, don't remember whether it's performance or the gaps. I think it's maybe the gaps. About 30, right around 30th. 31st, 32nd, something like that. We were right there together. Since they amended their constitution, Florida is now number 6. We are still in the 30s and going the other way.
Take one over here.
Justice Page, thank you very much for coming to Brainerd. I heard a speaker the other day talk about our court system being nonpartisan and suggested we remember these days fondly because we most certainly will be moving to a partisan system. What do you think about that?
There have been those who have been trying to move us to a partisan system since I joined the court. We are exceedingly fortunate here in Minnesota to have a true nonpartisan system. There are a number of states that have, in quotes, nonpartisan systems, but you look at how they function and you wonder how they are able to use that term. When I joined the court in 1993, Minnesota and Wisconsin are neighbor to the east. Our court systems look pretty much the same. You look at the two today, and you wouldn't recognize, you wouldn't believe that they were the same back then. Wisconsin's system has become highly partisan. You know, and courts have the only power courts have is the confidence that the people we serve have in the work that we do. And if you become partisan, when your judges have an interest in the outcome, there is no reason for people to have confidence or trust in the work that courts do. And you look at some states, they don't even try to hide it. Thinking Texas, thinking Mississippi, Alabama, thinking Ohio, Michigan. The influence of money in their judicial selection process is quite frankly frightening.
Thank you for coming here. Is this working?
Yes.
I've never been accused of having a soft, retiring voice, so I hope you all can hear me. Thank you, Justice, for coming tonight. I have a number of questions, but I'm just going to get the one, I think. You talk, the original language of the Constitution talks about an adequate system. You talked a lot about the inadequacies of that particular language and focusing on individual rights of each child. Did you consider, or have you considered at all, the funding mechanism of education historically being tied to property taxes and to land ownership, which has historically benefited certain segments of our population and been the detriment of other segments of our population? I'm thinking of racial disparities of property ownership. How would your proposed amendment address those very central systemic barriers to education? Maybe thought about language that, well, not language adding to the one that you proposed, but a way to address that fundamental barrier, which is we just don't have enough money in the places where we need it the most.
Well, I think our proposed language addresses that to some degree by making the obligation on the state, making it the state's paramount duty. That's one thing. But I quite frankly, I think the amendment will force us to rethink how we fund education, how we teach teachers, how we, literally every aspect of our educational system. It's going to force us to rethink that. We haven't tried to be prescriptive, but this language will require us to do whatever it takes to vindicate a child's right to a quality public education. And so I think how the funding formula, I mean, people start talking about that and my eyes glaze over because I don't get it. I don't understand it. But it's going to cause us to rethink all of that.
We'll take one over here.
Thank you, Judge, for coming out tonight. Why did you want to become part of the U.S. Supreme Court?
Why did I
Want to become part of the U.S. Supreme Court?
Why did I want to become a part of the Supreme Court? You know, I went to law school because as I noted, I was influenced by Brown versus the Board of Education and justice and fairness. It never occurred to me when I started on the legal journey, and I might one day be a judge, much less justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court. Odd thing happened, I think it was 1982, sometime early 1982. I woke up one morning and was reading the newspaper, and there was an article that said in effect that then Governor Perpich was going to appoint me to a trial judge, the district court seat in Hennepin County. Nobody had asked me. And it was kind of surreal to read your name in that context. And that's sort of the first time I thought about it. Needless to say, I didn't get appointed. But as I developed as a lawyer and sort of figured out what my strengths were, and having read any number of court decisions, which at best were challenging to figure out what the court was trying to say, I said to myself, with my ego that's bigger than this room, I could do a better job than that. And so I started thinking about it, and it really struck me that, you know, my strengths, at least as I perceived them, were in the work that appellate courts do, not in the work that trial courts do. I think as a trial court judge, I would have been, by my own standards, average at best. Just as an aside, as a football player, I came to the Vikings as a defensive end to evidently to send Jim Marshall or Carl Eller packing. And had I stayed a defensive end, I would have been an average defensive end at best and would have been around for a very short time. But my skills on the athletic field, on the football field, lend themselves well to what defensive tackles do. And I think my skills as a lawyer lend themselves to what appellate court judges do. And so thinking that the way to get to the appellate courts was to use the trial courts as a stepping stone, I thought on any number of occasions to get appointed to a trial court position, to no avail. And it wasn't just Governor Perpich that didn't appoint me. Governor Carlson didn't appoint me either. And so in 1990, due to mandatory retirement, one of the justices on the court was up for re-election, and had he stood for re-election and won, he would have been able to serve, I think it was 5.5 more months before he reached the mandatory retirement age. And so I thought I would seek to fill that seat by election. And I filed for election, and before I could get out of did it at the Secretary of State's office. Before I could get out of the office, the justice who I filed against resigned, created a vacancy, and the governor filled the vacancy, and therefore there was no more election. I was frustrated, angry, kind of took it personal, but decided there wasn't much I could do about it. 1992 comes along, and there was a justice who was up for re-election, and that mandatory retirement would have required him to retire roughly 18 months after being re-elected. Planned to file again, but before I could file, we have this provision in our Constitution and our statutes that allows for a judge's term to be extended under certain circumstances. The justice sought a term extension from the governor granted it, and the election disappeared again. I decided that this time well, I concluded that the term extension violated Minnesota's Constitution. And as a result, brought a lawsuit against the governor and the Secretary of State, which is not really what you want to do to get on the court, particularly given that the Supreme Court had original jurisdiction. But sometimes you have to do what you have to do. And I filed the lawsuit. All the members of the court recused, and somebody on the way out appointed a substitute court, 5 members, and shortly after oral arguments, they held in my favor, found the term extension unconstitutional, and gave me the opportunity to seek election. They also gave it to anybody else who wanted to seek election. And the 2 other people filed along with me, which meant there was going to be a primary. And it started almost immediately, not almost immediately, immediately. He's just a football player. Implicit but unstated, he's just a dumb football player. Implicit, mostly unstated, he's just a dumb black football player. Fortunately, the people of Minnesota didn't buy that, and it gave me the opportunity to serve. I will be forever indebted to the people of this state for allowing me the privilege of serving them.
That's very good. We're going to take a question up there in the corner.
Justice Page, that's a great story. And speaking of elections, with all the election stuff in the air today, there's been more emphasis on the role of local school boards. How do you see, or how would you like to see local school boards support this amendment?
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking with local school boards. And it's actually been a while since I've thought about their involvement, but I think I better not say that because I don't remember precisely. But you know, we've had some good conversations with local school boards, and they have their concerns about what we've proposed. You know, change is difficult. Change can be a little scary, but I don't think they've rejected what we propose out of hand.
We have another question down here.
Yes, right down here. Right up here, rather.
We're going to get you. We're going to get you eventually.
Mr. Kern here. Why don't we take Mr. Kern and then we'll come up here.
Go ahead,
Doug?
Mr. Kern.
Honorable Page, Judge Page, I'm so glad you didn't give up. You didn't give up. You pressed on. You know, there's so many things that you said that are awesome. I've never seen a child being left behind as far as the quality education. I've been around a long time, and I've seen people from the handicapped having all kinds of issues. If anybody would have been left behind, it would have been me as a child. I'm number 7 out of 14, grew up with an outhouse. The teachers and educators that I know, they are quality. I mean, they are so quality. And if it wasn't for the teachers and the educators that I had growing up, I wouldn't be where I am today. They gave me the opportunities. The thing that I see as the biggest problem that we have as far as education is the breakdown of the family. When we own apartments, I'm a landlord in the area, and I see so many families where the parents are working 2-3 jobs, don't have time to read to little Johnny. I see other ones that are on drugs, don't have time to read to little Johnny. I see the breakdown as a family as a huge, huge thing, the biggest issue. Because if a kid goes to school and they're hungry or they don't have, nobody's helped them, you know, the educational staff that I see, especially like in this area, they're awesome. They go above and beyond to help the children. In Minnesota, and thank you for your service, for serving on the Supreme Court. What would you attribute the #1 factor to you not giving up over the years?
#1 factor in me not giving up. I guess I happen to be optimistic, and I believe that each of us has the power to bring about change. You know, you raised the question about, well, family's role in what's going on. And, you know, I will just say, I mentioned Florida earlier, moved from roughly number 30 to number 6. Florida has dysfunctional families too. Florida has all the problems that we have here in Minnesota, and they've managed to make improvement. The other thing I would note is that, yes, there are problems, and there are hurdles and obstacles that we have to overcome. But just because they're there doesn't mean we can't overcome them if we work at it, if we put in the time, the energy, and the effort to create opportunity. We can't afford, you know, that just because somebody's family doesn't support them, we can't afford to just walk away from them. So.
All right, we'll take one right down here.
My question is about the starting age. Right now, our public education system starts our students at about 5 years old. Does this amendment make any modifications on a starting age where we can close the gap quicker and provide services to our children at a younger age?
The beauty of the language is all children. And so that opens up the possibility of early childhood education being included in this fundamental right.
I see a questioner up there and down here.
My name is Tracy Lyons. I go to this college and I'm a non-traditional student. I just turned 70 years old. And yes, I was left behind. Basically, I have attention deficit, dyslexia, and several other issues with like ACEs, if you know what ACEs is. And because of modern technology, I am able now to go to college and understand what's going on and being able to produce. And what I'm believing, exactly what you're saying, but I'm more curious of how to convince legislatures in a deeper way other than just contacting them, because there seems to be an extremely worrisome area in regards to money in the legislature being spent out other than just paying out of our property taxes for students.
Well, let me be blunt. Not everybody likes our constitutional amendment proposal. There are those who oppose it. One of the most significant groups that oppose it is Education Minnesota, Teachers Union. And I note the teachers union, not teachers. The teachers that we've spent time talking to, the teachers that I spent time talking to, they have questions, but they're looking for help. But their union opposes this at every turn. And we haven't figured out how to overcome that yet. Maybe you can talk to your teachers too.
All right, we'll take one back here. This young man.
You mentioned you started football in 9th grade. Were there any sports you played before football?
I played very poorly, mind you, basketball in 7th and 8th grade. Other than that, no. I was one of those kids that growing up when, you'd go out and play in the park and there'd be an odd number of children and they'd start picking sides. I was always the odd one out. But don't feel too badly for me.
It turned out okay.
It worked out in the end.
Right here in the middle. Go ahead, sir.
Name's Richard, and I'm from Nisswa. 2 quick questions. Did you try to stop Jim from going the wrong way?
When Jim ran the wrong way, I was at the University of Notre Dame.
Okay. You're off the hook. I think I'm hearing a conclusion from your working group that based on some measurable results, Minnesota's failing many students, and relative to other states, that's getting worse. Is that a good assessment of what I'm hearing?
Yes.
We have a questioner down here who has been waiting a long time. Can we get a mic down there?
At the microphone, so I think I'm first.
Very good. You're coming. Eric, can you bring the microphone to this young lady over here?
Yep.
She's been waiting a long time.
I'm Justice Page. I was wondering, since athletes and American politics are a growing phenomenon, and obviously stand on the shoulders of greats such as Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and even yourself, do you see achievement and competition at the highest level of sport as like being something that prepares you for a career in social justice and civic duty?
I think we're all prepared for that. I don't think it's just athletes. All of us have the ability and the opportunity. Some of us may be able to have more impact than others, but we can all have an impact. And we all have an interest. So it's not this, you know, the reality is that we look to athletes and entertainers as heroes and role models, but the reality is that we're influenced by those we can reach out and touch. And so everybody here in this room has those that they can reach out and touch and influence.
Never doubt.
Hi, as a student senate president here at CLC and a proud member of the Rosenmeier board, I want to thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
I'm also someone who is very passionate about K-12 education and the disparities that exist there. I wanted to ask, when you talk about individual learning, does auditory, tactile, and visual learning styles fit into that vision?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As I say, every child has a different learning style. And whether it's visual or auditory or tactile or whatever it is, we can accommodate that.
All right, we got one over here.
Hi, thank you for coming. I guess I just wanted to ask about doing this as a means of representing everyone equally, but like not overdoing it, because I think there's overdoing it with everything. Like there's definitely people who are struggling with these things, but I think what I've seen is that when you do things out of feeling bad for them, there can be like this tension that exists. Like even when you're trying to help someone out who and they understand that they have a mental or learning disability and you're trying to help them out, they can begin to get frustrated. And I guess I wouldn't want to do these things out of feeling bad for them, but just trying to do the right thing. Do you think maybe teachers need more mental and emotional training as far as going forward?
I think we're going to have to rethink how teachers are taught so that they learn to identify the needs of individual children and teach to those needs. And, teach to the needs of those who are different than they are.
Actually, and I won't, but I'm looking at our time here, and I want to be respectful to the Chief Justice, and I want to invite all of you to join me in giving a round of applause in appreciation for Justice Page being here with us and sharing your time, your inspiration, your knowledge, and certainly your leadership on this tremendously important issue. The city of Brainerd, Crow Wing County, Central Lakes College is tremendous beneficiaries of your presence here with us this evening. And so if you would all please join me.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming this evening.